Creativity helps us realize that we don't have to understand everything. We can enjoy something, feel it, and use it without ever fully comprehending it. Those were the words of Faith Ringgold, and she is the artist that we will be studying in art history today. So Faith Ringgold is an artist, but she is also known for her social activism. Her art confronted prejudice directly and made political statements. Her works provide insight into perceptions of white culture by African Americans and vice versa. She combines her African heritage and art traditions with her artistic training to create paintings, multimedia soft sculptures, and story quilts that elevated the sewn arts to the status of fine arts. So together today, we will dive deep into her life, her artwork, and her legacy. Before we get started though, here are 3 terms that I want you to remember. They will come up through our conversation today. They represent Faith Ringgold, and I just might test you on them in the end. So here they are. Quilting, culture, feminism. All right. Remember those 3 terms, because here we go, diving into the life and artwork of Faith Ringgold. Faith Ringgold was born October 8th, 1930, in the Harlem neighborhood of New York. She was the youngest of 3 children. Often unable to attend school due to asthma, Ringgold was encouraged in her artistic pursuits by her mother, who was a fashion designer. She taught her how to sew and use patterns. Ringgold helped with her mother's fashion shows and said that she taught me how to stand up there and have a little joke and just feel comfortable with myself and to self-promote one's work. Her grandmother taught Ringgold quilting and the importance of the African American tradition in telling stories, conveying messages, and creating community. Quilt making was a family tradition, as Ringgold's grandmother had learned the art from her mother, Susie Shannon, who had been a slave. During the period known as the Harlem Renaissance, Ringgold's neighborhood was home to many African American artists, writers, and musicians. She describes her experience as a wonderful childhood growing up in Harlem with many wonderful role models as neighborhoods. Among them were Thurgood Marshall, Dinah Washington, Aaron Douglas, and Duke Ellington. She grew up with a sense of vibrant creative possibilities, a strong sense of family and community, of artistic practice connecting generations, but she was also aware of the segregation, racism, and economic inequities. In 1950, intending to study art, Ringgold enrolled at New York City College, but because art was then believed to be an exclusively male profession, she was required to enroll in art education in order to study art. Characteristically, she took this obstacle as a kind of challenge to be overcome. As she herself said, "I have always known that the way to get what you want is don't settle for less. I always knew I would be an artist." Ringgold graduated in 1955 with a bachelor's degree in fine art and education. After graduation, Faith began teaching in the public school system in New York and began working towards a Master of Fine Arts degree at a city college. Earning her degree in 1959, Faith said, "I got a fabulous education in art, wonderful teachers who taught me everything except anything about African art or African American art. But I traveled and I took care of that part myself." Exploring what it meant to be an African American artist, Faith said, "I found my artistic identity and my personal vision in the 60s by looking at African masks. The powerful geometry of African masks and sculpture that informed modern art is what I like best about modern European painting masters I was taught to copy. It is their exquisite composure of shape, form, color, and texture that make Picasso, Matisse, and Jacob Lawrence work so wonderful." Finding it difficult as an African American woman artist to find gallery representation for her work, Faith had a meeting with Ruth White, who ran a gallery in New York in 1963 that proved life-changing. White, examining Ringgold's paintings of still lifes and landscapes, told her she could not show her works. Now, discussing this meeting afterwards with her husband, whom she had married in 1962, Ringgold said, "You know something? I think what she's saying is, it's the 1960s. All hell is breaking loose all over, and you're painting flowers and leaves. You can't do that. Your job is to tell your story. Your story has to come out of your life, your environment, who you are, where you come from." So in the early 1960s, with influences from those modern European painting masters and newfound inspiration in wanting to prove Ruth White wrong, she began painting the American People series. So the American People series, which Faith described as about the condition of Black and white America and the paradoxes of integration felt by many Black Americans. Now, this included 20 works, this series. Some of the images confront racism and racial violence, while others draw upon the Black Power or Black is Beautiful message that came out of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So this painting we're looking at here is from this series, the American People series. Here, Faith depicts an African American woman seated before a window, perhaps at the moment before getting dressed, as she appears to be wearing undergarments. The woman looks into a handheld mirror, while in the background, the window overflows with blue and green geometric trees and bushes. The black branches and trunks of the plants frame the woman and echo the curves and the angles of her form. The stylized rendering invokes the work of Picasso's Girl Before a Mirror, with the broad expanse of color heavily outlined in black. So there's that inspiration we talked of earlier. Now, the window behind the woman shows a kind of light-filled jungle, suggesting maybe an African landscape and creating the sense that the woman is at home in this setting. Its lushness complements and highlights the beauty of her image. Gazing at herself in her handheld mirror demonstrates to the viewer the importance of her own self-regard over those of the male gaze or of white society. The feminist viewpoint, combined with one of Black power, conveys the message that an African American woman is beautiful when regarded by herself. In 1967, Ringgold began the Black Light series. Now, with this series, she intended to create a more affirmative Black aesthetic. She also noted that white Western art was focused around the color white and the light contrast, while African American art and cultural art is generally using dark colors and emphasizes color rather than the light and the contrast. So through this Black Light series, she focused on the color black and using darker colors and the emphasis of dark colors. So these two series, American People and the Black Light series, according to the Newburgh's Museum, they say it informs everything else she did. And you really cannot fundamentally understand the rest of her body of work without seeing it in the context of those first works. So these first two works kind of bring together the rest of her creations. So at the same time where Faith is painting, working, she becomes an activist, a social activist for feminist and anti-racism causes. She co-founded the Ad Hoc Women's Art Committee, the Women Students and Artists for Black Art Liberation, the National Black Feminist Organization, and she inspired Arts Without Walls, which was an organization that brings art to prison population. Now, it was the early 1970s when Ringgold's work started moving away from traditional painting, and she began using fabric and experimenting with soft sculpture. She found influence from the traditional Western African use of masks. She created a series of work titled Family of Women Mask Series. Now, this portrayed 31 women and children from her childhood. She created costumes by painting linen canvas, and she added beads, raffia hair, painted gourds to portray different body parts, different parts of these women she's trying to represent. Now, the one we're looking at here is Aunt Bessie and Aunt Edith. Now, they are figures depicted wearing colorful beaded collars. One of them wears a whistle around her neck, which is reminiscent perhaps of some of the protests that Faith Ringgold did outside of museums that would not allow women artists or artists of color. Faith Ringgold would stand outside their exhibitions and blow a whistle to disrupt, so to let people know, hey, they wouldn't let me in here because I was a woman. Now, the expressions on these masks are wide-eyed, they're open-mouthed, they're highlighted by white lines that really emphasize the features, and they're surmounted by a braided wig. Now, her work with fabric kind of continues to evolve, continues to move on. And part of that evolution comes from a trip in 1972 that she took to Amsterdam. She went to a museum there and she saw an exhibit of thungas, which are Buddhist paintings on cloth scrolls. So she was inspired to add some fabric borders. Now, this was in the 80s. In the 1980s, she started quilting and creating paintings with fabric borders. Now, her first series of these with the fabric borders were supposed to be the viewpoint of an African woman taken into slavery. Then she did another series called Echoes of Harlem, which depicted 30 local residents. And this series was all fabric. It was quilt making. Now, quilts allowed Ringgold to tell stories by combining images with handwritten texts. So the narratives focused on a character. Sometimes she drew it from cultural history, such as this quilt here titled Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima? And sometimes she took it from autobiographical stories of her own life, such as this one titled Tar Beach. Now, Tar Beach is Ringgold's best-known work. It is the first quilt in her Woman on a Bridge series about a young African-American girl, Cassie Louise Lightfoot, growing up in Harlem. The story quilt depicts a family spending time outdoors on the rooftop or tar beach of their apartment building. In the center of the image, clothes are drying on the clothesline. 4 people are gathered around a table playing cards. Another table has food, and Cassie and her younger brother are resting on a blanket. The background depicts the New York City skyline, where Cassie is also shown flying over the George Washington Bridge. The scene is bordered by fabric squares, many of them with floral patterns, and at the top and bottom of the quilt, another border of rectangles contain text telling the girl's story. At the top left, the story begins. I will always remember when the stars fell around me and lifted me above the George Washington Bridge. Another section reads, Sleeping on Tar Beach was magical. Only 8 years old and in the 3rd grade, and I can fly. That means I am free to go wherever I want for the rest of my life. Ringgold's use of color and the repeating floral motif create a garden-like border and a sense of just familiar warmth. By painting decorative embellishments onto her piecework with the same color, she had subtly unified the many and varied colored blocks used to create the border. By adopting a folk technique that avoids perceptive and shading, Ringgold suggests that the experience depicted in the work is being expressed freely from within the life of her character. Now, Faith drew upon her own experiences growing up to create the character, but also wanted to convey an empowering feminist message. As she said of the series, my women are actually flying. They're just free, totally. They take their liberation by confronting this huge masculine icon, the bridge. A publisher, after seeing Tar Beach, her story quilt, expressed interest in Ringgold, turning the story quilt into a children's book. Tar Beach appeared in 1991, and this launched Faith's career as an author of an award-winning children's book. And it was based upon stories and images of her art projects. So with her new fame, Ringgold continued to develop images that questioned European art and culture from an African-American perspective. In her series, The French Collection, a group of noted African-American women from history, seated in a field of sunflowers, are depicted creating a quilt of sunflowers. The women depicted are Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, Ella Baker, Lou Hammer, and to the right of the women stands Vincent van Gogh, holding a vase of sunflowers, reminiscent of the 7 still lifes with sunflowers he painted while living in Arles, France. Here, he offers his sunflowers as a sign of respect and appreciation to these legendary women. So Ringgold represents that tradition of African-American quilt making as a collective effort, passed down through generations of women in her family, and she juxtaposes it with the tradition of the solitary male European painter, represented here by Van Gogh. The quilt they are making with the sunflowers is in harmony with the natural world that surrounds them. So Ringgold's style continued to evolve as she incorporated elements from contemporary art movements while simultaneously adopting new techniques in her fabric work. In the 1990s, along with her fame in the children's book world, Ringgold's style was influenced by colors and the repetitive imagery of abstract expressionism and pop art. She began using applique with fabric sewn onto canvas and photo etching. In 2000, she began to use silkscreen printing on pieces that used text and borders of fabric. Now, later years have offered Ringgold even more opportunities to reach larger audiences. In 2010, her people portraits, which were a series of 52 mosaics, were installed in a Civic Center subway station in Los Angeles. 2014, she created the billboard Groovin' High as an installation piece for the High Lines train stop at 18th Street and 10th Avenue in Los Angeles. And many of her later works are based upon her earlier story quilts. Her work just so intimately connected to her own experience as an individual in a community has often traveled full circle to becoming an integral part of the community. And she's still with us today, still out there creating. So what's her legacy? What is the legacy of Faith Ringgold? Now, Ringgold's work as an artist, an activist, and an educator has influenced both the art world and communities beyond the art world. Her founding or co-founding of many arts organizations focus on the issues faced by women of color, and it has created many opportunities for those artists. As I said, she's still alive today, and she continues to experiment in multimedia and continues to provide leadership to women in the art world. So, we have swam through the life of Faith Ringgold. Can you tell me those 3 terms I told you to remember? They are quilting, culture, feminism. So, it's time to put what we learned onto paper. Grab your art journal that I provided you, or just grab a piece of blank paper. Flip a paper over. I know you've got scrap paper in your room. Grab a pencil, pen, whatever you like to draw with. Today we're going to create a paper quilt in honor of Faith Ringgold. It's just going to take us about 5 minutes. I'm going to flip this camera over and show you how it's done. So I got my journal open to a blank page here. You know, feel free to use back and front of papers or not. Use some scratch paper too if you don't have a sketchbook handy. Today we're going to make a paper quilt in order of Faith Ringgold, our quilting artist. So, to do that, we are going to split our paper up here into 9 squares. So I'm just gonna draw about 1/3 of the way down a line, 1/3 of the way up a line. They're not even. That's fine. This is a sketching exercise. And then same thing, about 1/3 of the way in, line down. 1/3 of the way in, a line down. So today, who did we study, right? We studied Faith Ringgold. I'm just writing her in there. And yes, there's 2 G's, Ringgold. Now, she was known for her bold color, kind of her folk imagery, her patterns. She did a lot about Harlem and about girls, right? About famous women. So, in one of these squares, I'm going to draw a cityscape. So grab one of those squares and just start drawing some boxes representing some skyscrapers. There we go. City. As I said, she grew up in Harlem. She spent a lot of her time there, and a lot of her work is about Haarlem. Add some windows in, and remember, you can be as detailed or not detailed as you want. Now, in this box here, I'm going to draw sunflower. Remember that beautiful sunflower quilt we looked at with all those ladies and Vincent van Gogh? And she did do a lot of floral leaf patterns in the beginning and throughout her work. She kind of kept that going. Now, what were those words again? Right in. Feminism. Culture. Quilting. Those were our key words of Faith Ringgold today. Now, what is some other imagery? I'm going to do one more box here with you, and then I want you to dig deep back into there and fill the other boxes with things that, you correlate with Faith Ringgold. So up here, I'm actually going to do a face. I'm going to draw some eyes. I'm going to do a nice nose. Some lips. She drew a lot of people. She drew a lot of women, so I definitely want a face there. And you saw her faces weren't perfect. They were expressionism. So, okay, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more squares to fill in. Or leave them blank. It's up to you. But think of Faith Ringgold. Think of her quilting. Think of the masks that she made. Think of the bold colors that she used. Think back to those paintings, those pictures that we all just witnessed together, and let those flow your work. Maybe just some patterns in one square. She was always interested in the patterns of Western African masks. Maybe you want to draw more cityscapes. Maybe you want to add some leaves. She did put a lot of leaves and floral elements into her work. Maybe you want to add some more people in there. Whatever you want to do. Maybe you want to write a little bit more. She used writing in her work as well. But there is our fun little sketch for Faith Ringgold today. I hope that you enjoyed this program and that you enjoyed learning about her and you learned something new. Thanks for joining me, everybody, and happy creating.